The harness had broken in 3 places, and Stella Talbot was not about to ask a single soul in Redemption Creek for help fixing it. The year was 1878, and the town of Redemption Creek sat in the dry basin of southwestern Texas like a sun-bleached bone left on the prairie. It was a town that had earned its name honestly. Most of the people who passed through it were either running from something or hoping to redeem themselves from it. The summer heat pressed down on every wooden plank, every leather saddle, every cracked pair of boots, with the kind of insistence that made lesser people give up and head back east. Stella Talbot was not a lesser person. She had knelt down in the dust outside Whitmore's livery at 8:30 in the morning, her dark brown hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat that she had inherited from her father, the leather strap of which was cracked but holding. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows. There was a smear of grease on her left forearm. The harness in front of her was a double-rigged breast collar style, the kind used for a working draft horse rather than a riding horse, and the billet straps had torn through at the buckle holes on the near side from overuse and dry rot. Stella had learned harness work from her father, Walter Talbot, who had run a freight hauling operation out of this very town until a bout of pneumonia had taken him 3 winters ago. After that, the operation had passed entirely to Stella, who was 26 years old and fully capable of running it, though the men in Redemption Creek seemed perpetually confused by this fact. She had a rivet punch, a length of wax thread, a heavy-gauge needle, 2 spare buckles, and a pair of leather strips she had cut herself from a hide she kept rolled in the back of her wagon. She knew what she was doing. She was simply taking longer than she liked because the sun was already cooking the back of her neck, and the leather was stiffer than she had anticipated. It was in the middle of her second attempt to thread the needle. Her fingers were slick with the warm beeswax she had rubbed on the thread, that a shadow fell across her work. She did not look up immediately. In her experience, shadows that appeared without announcement usually belonged to men with opinions they had not been asked for. "That billet strap looks like it's been chewed on by something," said a voice. It was not unkind. It was not condescending either, which was unusual enough that Stella looked up. The man standing between her and the morning sun was tall, built like someone who had done hard work all his life rather than someone who had been born into ease. He wore a plain canvas shirt with the top button undone, dark trousers tucked into boots that were worn but clean, and a hat that had seen better decades. He had dark eyes set under heavy brows, a jaw that needed a shave, and an expression that was genuinely curious rather than smug. He was holding his own hat in his hands, which she had not expected, and that more than anything made her take a longer look. "It was chewed on by years," she said, returning to her needle. "I could fix that for you," he said. He did not move any closer. He just stood there with the hat in his hands like he was genuinely offering and genuinely prepared for her to say no. Stella looked at the buckle in her hand, then up at him again. She had heard those words before from other men, and they almost always meant one of 2 things. Either they wanted to take over the task entirely and then hold the favor over her head, or they wanted to make a show of their own competence at her expense. She was not interested in either. "Show me instead," she said. He blinked. It was a short blink, the kind that meant he had not expected that particular answer. Then something shifted in his expression, slow and genuine, and the corner of his mouth pulled just slightly in a way that was not quite a smile but was the honest beginning of one. "All right," he said, and crouched down across from her in the dust without any fanfare at all. His name, she learned in the next few minutes, was Jeremiah Keene. He was 29 years old and had ridden into Redemption Creek 2 days prior from a ranch south of the Pecos River, where he had been working as a hand for the better part of 4 years. He told her this in pieces, between showing her how to set the rivet punch at the angle that let the leather compress without splitting, and how to wet the edge of a new billet strap with a damp cloth before you tried to work it through a buckle that was even slightly stiff. Stella watched his hands. They were careful hands, precise without being fussy, and he did not rush. He set the punch, showed her where to strike, and then moved back and let her do it herself. He did not reach in to correct her. He watched, and when she got it right, he simply nodded and moved on to the next step. "You've done this before," she said. It was not a question. "Some," he said. "My father had a harness shop in Missouri. I worked it from the time I could hold a tool until I was old enough to head west." "What made you head west?" He was quiet for a moment. He picked up one of the spare buckles she had laid out and turned it over in his fingers. "The usual reasons," he said finally. "Looking for something different. Did you find it?" He glanced at her then, and there was something in the way he looked at her that was not the way men in Redemption Creek generally looked at her. He looked like he was actually thinking about the answer rather than preparing a charming response. "Not yet," he said. They worked for another 40 minutes. By the end of it, the harness was better repaired than Stella could honestly say she would have managed on her own in the same amount of time, not because Jeremiah had done the work but because he had shown her the small adjustments that made each step cleaner. She understood the harness better than she had that morning. She sat back on her heels and looked at it in the dust. "Thank you," she said. "You did it," he said. "I just talked." She looked at him steadily. "You know that is not entirely true." He smiled then, fully, and it changed his whole face. There was nothing practiced about it. It was simply the smile of someone who had been caught being modest and did not mind. "Jeremiah Keene," she said, extending her hand in the way she always did, directly and without hesitation. He took her hand and shook it firmly, the way you shook the hand of a person you respected. "I know," he said. "You're Stella Talbot. Everybody in town already told me who runs the freight operation." "Everybody in town tells it wrong, I expect," she said. "They said you inherited it from your father," he said. Seemed pretty straightforward. "They say it like inheriting means I am temporarily holding it until a man comes along to run it properly." She kept her voice level. It was old frustration, worn smooth by years of repetition, but it was real. Jeremiah looked at her for a moment. "That would be a foolish thing to think," he said, "especially after watching you work." It was a simple statement. She had heard more ornate compliments in her life that had meant considerably less. She picked up the harness and stood, shaking the dust from her skirt with her free hand. "Where are you headed after Redemption Creek?" she asked. "I'm not entirely sure yet," he said, standing as well and brushing the dust from his knees. "I heard there might be work in the area. Freighting, possibly." She raised her eyebrows at him. "Is that so?" "That's what I heard," he said, and his voice was entirely neutral, but his dark eyes were watching her with that same quality of genuine attention she had noticed from the start. She looked at the harness in her hands, then at the livery behind her, then at the man standing in the dust of the street with his hat still held in both hands. "I have a freight run to Fort Stockton at the end of the week," she said. "I could use a second driver if you know how to handle a 4-horse hitch." "I know how to handle a 6-horse hitch," he said. "The end of the week," she said. "Thursday morning, 6 o'clock, behind the livery." "I'll be there," he said. She nodded once, tucked the repaired harness under her arm, and walked back toward the livery without looking back. Though she did listen, just for a moment, for the sound of his footsteps, to know which direction he went. He went toward the far side of the street, unhurried, and she heard him greet someone from the sound of a brief exchange. He sounded like a man who had nowhere in particular to be and was not troubled by it. Stella Talbot had not been troubled by a man in a long time. She was not sure what to do with the fact that she was thinking about this one. The town of Redemption Creek was not large by any generous measure. It had a general store run by the Whitfield family, a saloon called the Red Lantern that was not as rough as some she had seen but was not exactly genteel either, a small church that the Reverend Hodges held together through sheer stubbornness and donated lumber, a post office that doubled as a telegraph office, 2 boarding houses, Whitmore's livery, a barber shop, and a doctor's office that the doctor, a practical woman named Clara Voss who had trained in Philadelphia, occupied also as her home. There was a small schoolhouse at the north end of town that served perhaps 15 children depending on the season and how many farming families had decided to stay or move on. Stella owned a small house on the western edge of town that had been her father's. She had added a proper workroom to the back of it where she kept her tools, her ledgers, her spare harness equipment, and the small desk at which she did the accounting that kept the freight operation running. She was not wealthy by any measure, but she was solvent, which in 1878 in southwest Texas was its own kind of achievement. She did not think about Jeremiah Keene for the rest of that Monday. She thought about him on Tuesday morning when she was reviewing the manifest for the Fort Stockton run and realized she had noted the new hire without even consciously deciding to hire him. She thought about him again on Tuesday afternoon when she passed the boarding house on her way to the general store and thought for a brief, absurd moment about whether he was staying there or at the other one on the east side of town. She thought about him on Wednesday when old Pete Garland, who had driven second wagon for her father for 12 years and for Stella for the 3 since, came to tell her that his back had given out again and he would not be fit to drive to Fort Stockton by Thursday. "I'm sorry, Miss Stella," Pete said, standing at her workroom door with his hat in his hands and genuine regret on his weathered face. "The thing just locked up on me yesterday evening. Clara Voss says if I try to drive a wagon 4 days each way I'll be bedridden for a month." "Don't apologize, Pete," she said. "Rest it. I have someone else for this run." Pete looked relieved, then curious. "You do?" "I hired a man on Monday," she said. Pete raised his eyebrows but said nothing further, which was one of the things she appreciated most about Pete Garland. He knew when to let a thing be. On Wednesday afternoon, Stella went to check on the wagon she would be driving herself, and the second wagon she would need a driver for, and found that she needed to reconfigure the harness arrangement on the second team, because 2 of her horses had been reshod, and the balance was different. This took her 2 hours and brought her outside the livery again in the late afternoon light that turned everything in Redemption Creek the color of warm amber. She did not expect to find Jeremiah Keene sitting on the fence outside the livery corral, talking to the horses. He was not talking to them in the self-conscious way that people sometimes did when they knew they were being watched and wanted to seem interesting. He was talking to the nearest horse, a big gray draft named Cannonball, in a low, easy voice, and the horse had his massive head over the fence rail with his ears tilted forward in the specific attitude of a horse that is genuinely engaged. Stella watched for a moment from the shadow of the livery door. "You are enormous," Jeremiah was saying to Cannonball in the tone of a man who considered this a worthy observation, "and you clearly know it." Cannonball blew air from his nostrils approvingly. "I don't hold it against you," Jeremiah said. "I've known men who were enormous and didn't carry themselves nearly as well." Stella walked out of the shadow. Jeremiah heard her boots on the packed earth and turned without startling, which meant he had probably known she was there for at least a moment before he turned. "He likes people," she said, coming to stand beside the fence. "Cannonball. He was a difficult horse for years, and my father worked with him every single day, and now he is the easiest in the team." Jeremiah looked at the horse. "It shows. There's something patient about him." "My father had that quality," she said, and it came out more quietly than she had intended. She cleared her throat. "The harness arrangement on the second team is different from what you may be used to. I was going to walk through it with you tomorrow morning, but you're here now if you have time." "I have time," he said, and swung off the fence easily. She showed him the arrangement. He listened carefully, asked 2 practical questions, and adjusted his mental map of the rig without any fuss. She noticed he had already introduced himself to 3 of the 4 horses in the second team without being told to, which meant either he had good instincts or long experience, and in her experience, those things tended to come together. "You said you came from a ranch south of the Pecos," she said as they were finishing. "What kind of freight experience do you have?" "I drove for a general freight operation out of San Angelo for a year before the Pecos ranch," he said. "Before that I spent 2 years doing supply runs for a mine operation in New Mexico territory." She looked at him. "That's not what you told me Monday. You said you heard there might be freighting work in the area." He met her eyes and had the grace to look just slightly caught. "That's also true," he said, "but you already had the experience." "I didn't want to assume you were looking for experience," he said. "I wanted to see if you were someone I wanted to work for." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the late afternoon carried the sound of the town settling into evening, the distant clink of the Red Lantern's front door, a child calling somewhere down the street, the dry tick of the cooling wood of the livery roof. "And," she said, "I showed up Wednesday evening to check the horses," he said. "That's probably answer enough." She could not argue with that. She picked up the last of her tools from the fence rail. "Thursday, 6 o'clock. "Thursday," he said, 6 o'clock. She walked back through the livery and out the far side, and this time she did not wonder about the sound of his footsteps. She was thinking about the manifest and the route and the usual calculations of a freight run. But underneath all of that, steady and warm as a banked fire, was the awareness that Jeremiah Keene was a man who showed up early, talked to horses, and let her do her own work. Those things, in her particular experience, were not common. The road to Fort Stockton ran southeast through terrain that was demanding in its beauty, long flat stretches of caliche and scrub brush broken by sudden limestone bluffs, dry creek beds that could flash to dangerous water if it had rained in the hills, and the kind of sky that seemed larger than sky had any right to be. Stella drove the lead wagon with Cannonball and his 3 teammates, and Jeremiah drove the second wagon with the Rashad team. They did not talk much for the first 2 hours. The work of driving a heavy freight wagon across rough terrain required attention, and she respected the fact that he gave it the attention it required. When the road smoothed out enough in the late morning to allow for a more relaxed hand, she slowed her team to let his catch up so they were running side by side. "How did your father come to run freight out of Redemption Creek?" he asked. The question was asked with genuine interest, looking at the road ahead rather than at her, which she found easier. "He came west in '62, she said. "He had been a cooper in Ohio, but there wasn't enough work there for what he needed to earn. He came to Texas with the intention of buying land, and when he got to Redemption Creek, he found the land prices were already beyond what he had saved, but there was a man trying to sell off a freight operation because he was too old to run it. My father bought it for less than he would have spent on land and found he was better suited to moving things than growing them." "And your mother?" "She came west with him," Stella said. "She died when I was 11. A fever." "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the particular kind of sorry that meant he understood loss rather than the kind that was merely polite. "She was a capable woman," Stella said. "She would have found all of this," she gestured broadly at the wagon and the road and the sky, "very reasonable." Jeremiah smiled at the road. "Is that a family trait? Finding unreasonable things reasonable, finding hard things worth doing?" She considered that for a moment. The wagons rolled on. A hawk circled in the thermal above the bluff to the right, hanging still as painted glass against the blue. "I think it is," she said. They made camp that first night beside a dry creek bed, where a seep of groundwater came through the limestone, just enough to water the horses. Jeremiah set up his camp on the far side of the wagons without being asked, which meant she had privacy for her own, and he made coffee without ceremony and brought her a tin cup while she was working on the evening feed tallies in her ledger. "You keep meticulous records," he said, glancing at the open ledger page before catching himself. "I apologize. That's none of my business." "No, it is not," she said, but not sharply. "But the reason is practical rather than personal. If I do not keep meticulous records, the men at the receiving end of these deliveries find reasons to adjust the tallies in their favor." He sat down on the other side of the small fire she had made and turned his coffee cup in his hands. "That happens often. Often enough," she said. "A woman running a freight operation on her own is either suspected of cheating or assumed to be ignorant. The records make both of those arguments very difficult to sustain." He was quiet for a moment. The fire snapped. Above them, the Texas sky was doing what it did best out here away from any town, filling itself with stars so dense they looked like spilled flour on dark cloth. "That's not right," he said, and he said it simply and flatly, the way you state a fact rather than perform an opinion. No, she agreed. It is not. But right and actual are two different categories out here, as you probably know. I know, he said. I've seen it work against people in worse ways than that. She looked at him across the fire. The firelight moved over the angles of his face and made him look older and then younger and then simply present, which was what he was. The mine in New Mexico territory, she said. The workers there, he nodded once, his jaw tightening slightly. Mostly Mexican men and a few Apache who had left the reservation to find work. They were paid half what the Anglo workers were paid for the same work. When they complained, they were let go and new men brought in. I drove supply runs and watched it happen twice. He paused. I left after the second time, because you refused to be part of it, because I couldn't change it from the outside of it and I couldn't stomach being part of it, he said. I don't know if that's courage or just a strong preference for being able to sleep. It might be both, she said. He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup, and something in his expression shifted toward the warmth she had seen glimpses of since Monday morning. You're more direct than most people I've met, he said. My father raised me to say what I meant, she said. He said life was too short for the other kind. He was right, Jeremiah said. They sat with that for a while, the fire burning down, the stars wheeling overhead so slowly you could only track their movement if you looked away and looked back. It was the particular kind of quiet that exists between two people who have stopped needing to fill it, and Stella noticed it only because it was unusual. She was generally comfortable with silence, but she was also generally alone. This was comfortable in a different way. The Fort Stockton delivery took 2 days driving from Redemption Creek. They arrived at the Army post at midday on Saturday, and Stella handled the receiving officer herself, which was a lieutenant named Ferris who had dealt with her twice before and had long since stopped being surprised by her. She presented her manifest and watched him count the goods against it, and when he tried to sign off short by 2 barrels of nails and 1 crate of salt beef, she pointed to the manifest, her loading records, and the tally she had taken herself that morning at departure, and he corrected the count without argument. Jeremiah had watched the whole exchange from near the second wagon without interfering, and when they walked away toward the livery to rest the horses, he said, "You did that exactly right." "I always do it exactly right," she said. "The first time I came here without my father they tried to short me by $20 worth of goods. They do not try that anymore." He glanced at her sideways, and there was undisguised admiration in his expression that he made no effort to hide. "How old were you the first time you came alone?" 22, she said, "and you just handed it right back to them." "I had the records," she said simply. They spent the night at Fort Stockton at the Teamsters, lodging the post provided, ate in the mess hall which was loud and smelled of pipe smoke and salt pork, and were back on the road toward Redemption Creek by 5 the next morning. The return trip was lighter without the cargo, and the horses moved faster on the empty wagons. They made good time. On the second day of the return trip, somewhere between a cluster of mesquite and a long ridge of pale limestone, Jeremiah's left front wheel found a rut and came down wrong, and there was the sharp crack that every freight driver dreaded. Stella heard it and pulled her team immediately. She was off her box and at his wagon before he had fully set the brake. The wheel was not broken, but the linchpin had sheared and the wheel had canted hard to the right. The axle was intact, which was the important thing. "I have a spare linchpin," she said immediately, already moving to the tool box under the second wagon seat. "Of course you do," he said, and it was not sarcastic. It was genuine and warm. "My father's first rule of the road," she said, locating the small metal pin and straightening. "Carry spares of everything that is small and essential, because big problems are expensive but small failures are just embarrassing." "He sounds like someone I would have liked," Jeremiah said. She passed him the linchpin. He looked at it for a moment, then at the wheel. "I can get under that corner," he said, "but I could use a second person to hold the wheel true while I seat the pin." "Tell me what you need," she said, Hold the wheel upright, both hands on the rim, and keep it steady when I call for it." "All right." They worked together quickly, and she held the wheel with both hands braced, her feet planted in the calice, while he seated the pin with a quick strike of the hammer. The wheel settled true. "Good," he said, crawling out from beneath the axle and standing, brushing red dust from his shirt. He looked at the wheel with satisfaction. "That'll hold us back." She was looking at him, not the wheel. There was a streak of rust-red dust across his jaw, and his dark hair was pushed back from his forehead, and he looked the way people look when they have been useful in a specific and satisfying way. She looked away quickly and brushed at her own hands unnecessarily. "Yes," she said, "it will hold us back." They were on the road again within 20 minutes, and for the rest of that afternoon, she was aware of a change in the quality of the silence between them. It was the same comfortable silence, but it had gathered depth, the way a river looks different once you know it is deeper than it appears. They arrived back in Redemption Creek on Tuesday evening. The sun was going down behind the low western hills, and the town was settling into the purple and orange of a summer dusk. Stella paid Jeremiah at the livery after the horses were settled, the amount she had agreed to, without hesitation. He folded the money and put it in his shirt pocket. "Thank you," he said. "For the work. Thank you for the driving," she said. "You were steady on the road. Pete Garland is good, but he does not handle a 4-horse hitch as well as you do." "That's high praise from you," he said, and his tone carried just enough warmth that she could not quite pretend it was entirely professional. She started to turn away and then stopped, which surprised her as much as anyone. "There is a social at the church on Friday evening," she said. "The Reverend Hodges holds one every few weeks. It is not exactly entertaining, but the food is good, and there is usually fiddle music." He was watching her with those dark eyes that did not look away. "Are you asking me to accompany you?" She met his eyes directly. "I am telling you it exists, in case you are looking for a way to spend a Friday evening in a town with limited options." "And if I told you I would be there," he said, "and asked if you would save me a dance?" The word "save" did not escape her. She was quiet for a moment, the evening air warm around them, the sound of cannonballs settling in his stall just behind the livery wall. "I would say that I do not generally dance at these things," she said, "but I have done it before when asked properly." "Then I am asking properly," he said, and his voice was quiet and certain, the way he spoke when he was not performing anything at all. "Friday evening," she said, 7:30 at the church." She walked home in the last of the evening light and stood in her workroom for a long moment looking at nothing in particular. Then she sat down at her desk, opened the freight ledger to a clean page, and tried to concentrate on the next run's planning, and could not, quite, focus on any of it. Redemption Creek on a Friday evening in the summer was not the kind of place that put on elaborate entertainment. Reverend Hodges' socials were simple things, long tables of food prepared by the ladies of the congregation, a cleared space for dancing on the packed earth behind the church, and Clarence Webb playing fiddle with his son on guitar, and his daughter on a battered upright piano that had been hauled out the back doors for the occasion. The lanterns were strung from a rope between 2 posts, and they swung gently in the evening breeze, painting the faces of the townspeople in warm gold. Stella arrived in a dress she rarely wore, a deep blue cotton with small white flowers at the collar, and immediately felt slightly foolish for it. She was not a woman who spent energy on foolishness, but the dress had seemed right when she put it on, and continued to seem right now that she was here. So she kept herself from pulling at the collar and stood at the edge of the food table talking to Clara Voss, the doctor, who was one of the few people in town whose company she genuinely enjoyed. Clara Voss was 32, sharp and practical, with light brown hair and the kind of direct gaze that went with a profession that required you to see things clearly. She had come to Redemption Creek 5 years ago from Philadelphia and was staying, she said, because the need was real and the work was never boring. "You look like you're waiting for something," Clara said, handing Stella a piece of cornbread. "I look like I'm eating cornbread," Stella said. "You look like both," Clara said pleasantly. Stella was about to respond when she saw Jeremiah come around the side of the church. He had found a clean shirt, dark blue, and had shaved. His hair was combed back. He looked different in the way that people look different when they have made a slight effort, which is to say he looked like himself, but also like he was conscious of being seen. He scanned the gathering with those steady dark eyes and found her within a few seconds, and the way his expression changed when he did was not a small thing. Clara Voss said very quietly, "Ah, do not," Stella said. "I haven't said a word. You were about to." "I was going to ask if that is your new freight driver," Clara said, entirely too innocently. "He is," Stella said, and went to meet him. "He said you found the blue dress," and then looked like he had surprised himself by saying it. She raised her eyebrows. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said carefully, "that the first day I saw you, I thought about what color you would wear to something that wasn't work, and I was right." She stared at him for a moment. It was possibly the most specific thing anyone had ever said to her in the context of how she looked, and the fact that it was specific rather than general made it land somewhere entirely different. "You are going to be trouble," she said. "Probably some," he agreed, and offered his arm in a way that was perfectly old-fashioned and sincere, and she took it. They ate together at one of the long tables, and she introduced him to people, and he shook hands and was easy in conversation without being performative about it. He talked to old Pete Garland for 10 minutes about the Fort Stockton Road and Pete's back trouble, and she watched Pete's expression shift from the polite courtesy extended to strangers to the genuine engagement of a man talking to someone he found worthwhile. She noticed Jeremiah asking questions more than making statements, and she noticed the quality of attention he gave to the answers. When Clarence Webb struck up a reel, Jeremiah turned to her with that not-quite smile and held out his hand. "I believe I asked properly," he said. "You did," she said, and took his hand. He danced well, which she had not expected and perhaps should have. He was not showy about it. He moved with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, steady, present, aware of where she was and where he was in relation to her. When the reel ended and something slower began, a simple waltz that Clarence played with his eyes half closed and a particular sweetness, Jeremiah did not step back the way he might have. He kept her hand and drew her slightly closer, and they moved together through the warm lantern light with the fiddle singing above them, and the summer night pressing its heat gently against every edge. "Can I ask you something?" he said, close enough that she could hear him clearly without him raising his voice. "You can ask," she said. "Have you always run the freight operation alone, since your father died?" "Yes," she said. "Not by necessity," he said. "It was not quite a question. Partly necessity," she said, "but mostly by preference. I tried taking on a partner the first year, a man named Dunmore. He was experienced and not unkind, but after 2 months he started making decisions without telling me and presenting them as done facts. He seemed genuinely confused when I objected." "What happened?" "I told him our partnership was finished," she said. "He told several people in town that I was too headstrong to work with a man. Reverend Hodges, of all people, told him that headstrong was a quality, not a flaw, and perhaps Dunmore should consider what it felt like to be on the receiving end of someone who made decisions without asking." Jeremiah made a sound that was low and warm. "I like the Reverend. He is more interesting than he looks," she agreed. They danced through 2 more songs, and then the music shifted to something livelier, and they stepped back and stood side by side at the edge of the dancing and watched other people. And Stella was aware of the fact that they were standing close enough that the sleeve of his shirt occasionally touched her arm, and she did not move away from it. Later, when the social was winding down and people were gathering their things and making the easy conversational exits of a community that expected to see each other again soon, Jeremiah walked her home. It was not far. Redemption Creek was not large, but the night was warm and clear, and the stars were out, and they walked slowly enough that the distance stretched pleasantly. At the gate of her father's house, her house, she turned to face him. "I have a run to San Antonio planned for August," she said. It is 6 days out and 5 back. The cargo is mostly dry goods and hardware. Pete Garland's back should be recovered by then, but I will need a second driver who can handle the terrain." He looked at her in the dark with the starlight working on the sharp lines of his face. "Are you offering me the work?" "I am offering it if you want it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him considering something beyond the work itself, something that had more weight to it than freight routes and paying wages. "I want to be clear about something," he said carefully. "When I ask if I can call on you, it is not because of the work, and I want you to know that before I ask so that the two things are not confused." She looked at him for a long moment. The night was still around them. Somewhere down the street, the last of the social lanterns were being extinguished one by one. "They are not confused," she said. "Then may I call on you?" he said. "Not as your driver, as someone who would like to know you better." "You may," she said. He did not try to kiss her then, which she respected. He simply nodded once with that same quality of certainty he brought to everything and said good night and walked back down the street. She watched him go, and then went inside and stood in her kitchen for a long time in the dark, not thinking anything in particular, just being still with the warm feeling that had settled in her chest and showed no sign of leaving. The months that followed were not a courtship in the conventional sense, because nothing about Stella Talbot operated in the conventional sense, and Jeremiah Keene seemed to understand this instinctively. He called on her in the morning sometimes, arriving at the workroom door with 2 cups of coffee from the boarding house where he kept a room, sitting across the desk from her while she worked through the day's planning and asking questions about the operation that were smart and practical rather than decorative. He took the second driver's role on the San Antonio run, and did it with the same competence and steadiness he had brought to the Fort Stockton run, and he drove the horses like they were worth treating well, which she had always considered a reliable indicator of character. He told her about Missouri, about the harness shop and the smell of leather and oil and the sound of his father's hammer, about the year he spent in New Mexico territory and what it had cost him in sleep, and in the particular kind of guilt that comes from witnessing injustice and being unable to stop it entirely. He told her about the Pecos River Ranch with a kind of measured honesty that acknowledged it had been good work under a fair man, but that he had known for months before he left that he was waiting for something different without being able to name what different meant. She told him about the freight ledgers and the system her father had taught her, and the modifications she had made to it. She told him about the first winter she had run the operation alone, when she had nearly lost 2 horses to a disease that swept through the valley, and had sat up 3 nights in a row with a lamp, and the veterinary manual Pete Garland had given her, learning what she needed to learn. She told him about the fact that she had wanted, once, to go to proper school east of Texas, and that the timing had never been right, and that she had eventually stopped waiting for the timing to be right, and decided that what she was learning out here was its own kind of education. He listened to all of it with the quality of attention she had first noticed in the dust outside the livery, the particular kind of listening that does not wait for its turn to speak. By September she had stopped pretending, even to herself, that this was simply a professional arrangement. By October, when the air had finally decided to release some of its summer heat and the evenings were cool enough for a jacket, they were sitting on the back step of her house after supper on a Wednesday, and he was close enough that their shoulders were touching, and neither of them had done anything to make that stop. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. He looked out at the dark yard, at the one cottonwood her father had planted that was losing its leaves in the dry autumn way, dropping them one at a time with no particular urgency. "I have been thinking about what comes next," he said. "Not just for the next run or the next season, for longer than that." She was quiet. The wind moved through the cottonwood and it made a dry, patient sound. "I would like," he said carefully, "to be part of something permanent here, not as a hired driver, as something with more standing than that." He turned to look at her. I am saying this badly because I want to say it right and I don't know exactly what the right words are. I think the right words are probably, she said, are you asking to stay? I'm asking if you want me to stay, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. October starlight, the smell of dry leaves and the cold that was not quite here yet but was coming. She had been alone for a long time. She had built the aloneness into a workable shape, made it functional and even comfortable, told herself it was sufficient. And it had been, until it wasn't, which was approximately the Monday morning in July when a man had crouched in the dust across from her and let her do her own work. I want you to stay, she said. He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, just the simple claiming of the hand of someone who has been granted permission, and held it. They sat like that for a long time on the back step of her father's house, with the cottonwood losing its leaves and the stars bright and cold, and the whole of Redemption Creek quiet around them. In November, Jeremiah proposed. He did it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with coffee and nothing particular planned. He slid a small ring across the table. It was silver, simply made, with a single small turquoise stone set in it, which he had bought from a Comanche trader who came through town and whose goods were fine and honest. He told her afterward that he had not planned the morning particularly, but that the ring had been in his pocket for 3 weeks, and the right moment had turned out to be a Sunday morning with coffee, and her looking at the freight route maps with her reading spectacles on, which was, he said, the most herself she ever looked. She picked up the ring and looked at it for a long time, turning the turquoise in the early light. Yes, she said. He smiled. She put the ring on her own finger, which seemed appropriate. They were married in December in the Reverend Hodges' church on a day cold enough that the women's breath made small clouds inside the building before the wood stove drove the chill back. It was a simple ceremony. Clara Voss stood at Stella's side, and Pete Garland, who had been informed of the engagement with a nod and a long look, and then a firmly extended hand, stood at Jeremiah's. The Reverend Hodges, who had indeed said something useful to Dunmore about headstrong being a quality not a flaw, performed the ceremony with the kind of sincere warmth that made people in Redemption Creek show up to his church even when they were not particularly religious. When the Reverend asked Stella if she would have Jeremiah Keene, she said yes in the voice she used for things she had decided with certainty, which was a quieter and more absolute voice than the one she used for everything else. Jeremiah's hands were warm around hers, and his dark eyes never left her face. When it was done and the Reverend pronounced them married, Jeremiah kissed her with a tenderness that made Clara Voss look at the ceiling briefly for reasons she did not explain. They walked out of the church into the December cold, and the townspeople they knew, which was most of Redemption Creek, made the sounds of celebration that small communities make when two of their own do something worth celebrating. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold but manageable. They lived in the house that had been Stella's father's, which was her house, and Jeremiah quietly did not make any adjustment to this fact beyond moving his gear from the boarding house. He had brought, in total, 2 trunks of possessions, a leather-handled knife that had been his father's, and a bay saddle horse named Morgan who went into the livery alongside Cannonball, and the draft team with no apparent objection from any of them. The freight operation continued. Jeremiah took on more of the driving as Pete Garland's back became less reliable through the winter months, and they split the route planning and management in a way that developed naturally from the fact that Stella was better with the administrative side and Jeremiah was slightly better with the horse medicine, and there was enough of both to keep them both fully occupied. They did not argue about who was in charge, because it was understood without discussion that Stella was in charge of the business and Jeremiah was in charge of the horses and the mechanical side of the equipment, and these were different domains that overlapped comfortably without competition. They did argue sometimes about other things, about the route to San Antonio, which Stella had always taken through Comstock, but Jeremiah thought the Langtree cutoff saved meaningful time when the weather was right. They argued about whether to buy a third wagon, which Stella thought was premature and Jeremiah thought was necessary for the new county contract she had been working on. They argued with the particular quality of people who argue about real things rather than the displaced arguments of people who are unhappy with each other, which is to say they argued about the subject at hand and then stopped and ate supper and were fine. He was right about the Langtree cutoff. She acknowledged this without ceremony. She was right about the third wagon timing, because the county contract fell through in March, and a third wagon would have been an unnecessary expense. He acknowledged this in the same way. They were well matched in the particular area of being willing to be wrong. In the spring of 1879, two things happened that changed the shape of their life. The first was the county contract, which did not fall through entirely but was reformulated. The county commissioner, a man named Briggs who had always been professionally courteous to Stella and nothing more, came to see her in April and offered her a 3-year agreement for supply runs to 3 of the county's outlying settlements. The agreement was worth more money than she had ever had on contract at one time, and it required a third wagon and a third driver. She hired the driver from a list Pete Garland gave her, a quiet young man named Samuel Ortiz who was 23 years old, had grown up in the area, knew the terrain as well as anyone alive, and drove with a steadiness that impressed her on his first run. Jeremiah came back from Samuel's first trip saying the man was a natural, and Pete, who had ridden along as a matter of introduction, agreed. The third wagon was purchased from a man in Fort Stockton who was liquidating his operation, and it was in better condition than the 2 they already had. The second thing that happened in the spring of 1879 was that Stella realized, on a Tuesday morning in April when she was looking at the freight ledger and finding herself entirely unable to think clearly about numbers, that she was expecting a child. She told Jeremiah that evening while he was in the small barn behind the house checking Morgan's left foreleg, which had been slightly sore after the last run. He was crouched down with the horse's leg across his knee, and she came to stand in the barn door with the April evening behind her and said, simply, what she had figured out. He set the horse's leg down very carefully and stood up and turned around, and his face did something she had not seen it do before. It went very still and then very open, all at once, the way a door goes when someone unlatches it from inside. He crossed the barn in 4 steps and put his arms around her, and she let him, and they stood there in the barn with Morgan looking at them with the patient curiosity of a horse that had seen stranger things, and the evening light came through the barn door and settled over them like something that had been planned. "We are going to need a larger house," she said, into his shoulder. He laughed, the particular laugh of someone who is full of something larger than regular feeling. "We have time," he said. "Not as much as you might think," she said. He pulled back enough to look at her face. She looked back at him steadily in the way she did when she was stating a fact about the world. "December," he said. "Something like that," she said. He kissed her then, carefully and then less carefully, and Morgan moved to the other side of his stall with the dignified air of a horse who required a certain degree of privacy. The summer of 1879 was the busiest of Stella's professional life. The county contract routes were running well, which meant keeping track of 3 wagon loads and 3 sets of horses, and the accounting for all of it simultaneously, while also managing a pregnancy that her body was handling competently, but which made the 100-degree Texas summer more exhausting than usual. Clara Voss checked in on her regularly and told her with complete honesty that she was healthy and should keep working until she felt she needed to stop, and that sitting idle would do her less good than staying occupied. Stella kept working. Jeremiah stayed close, not in the hovering way that she would have found stifling, but in the way of a person who adjusts his orbit slightly without announcing it. He took on more of the physical side of the equipment work. He expanded the route planning sessions to evening conversations at the kitchen table, so she did not have to spend long hours in the workroom. He learned to cook 6 things properly, which she considered a significant contribution to the household in a summer when she found the smell of raw meat exhausting. In the evenings, they sat on the back step or at the kitchen table and talked about the business and the town, and the things they had read in the newspapers that arrived 2 weeks late from San Antonio. And sometimes they did not talk at all but simply existed in the same space with the contentment of people who have found the right fit. He began, that summer, to build the addition to the house. It was not elaborate. It was a room off the back that he framed up over 3 weekends with help from Samuel Ortiz and Pete Garland, who was more capable with a hammer than with a sore back on a freight wagon, and seemed to enjoy the work. Clara Voss came one Saturday afternoon and inspected the progress with the same eye she turned on everything, declared it solid, and was handed a cup of coffee by Jeremiah without having to ask for it, which she said was the sign of a well-run household. The room was finished in September, in time to be properly dry and settled before the weather changed. It had 2 windows, which let in the morning light, and Jeremiah put a shelf on the east wall without being asked. Their son was born in late November of 1879, 2 weeks earlier than Clara Voss had expected, on a cold night with the north wind working at the window corners and the wood stove making the bedroom warm and amber-lit. Clara delivered him with her usual competence, and Jeremiah sat where she told him to sit, and did what she told him to do, and held Stella's hand for 4 hours with the complete, quiet steadiness that was the most essentially himself thing about him. The boy came into the world loudly, which Clara pronounced a good sign, and was placed in Stella's arms while Clara worked, and looked up at his mother with the enormous dark eyes of a person who had opinions about his circumstances that he was presently articulating at volume. "He has your eyes," Stella said to Jeremiah, who had leaned down over her shoulder to look at the boy's face. "He has your expression," Jeremiah said, which was true. The baby was looking at the room with a combination of sharp attention and clear assessment that his father found entirely familiar. They named him Walter, after Stella's father, which Stella had decided sometime in the summer without telling Jeremiah, and when she told him the name, he looked at her for a moment and then said quietly that he thought it was exactly right. Walter Keene was a healthy child who slept well enough that both his parents were able to function and grew with the speed and determination of something that had been planning to be large from the start. By the time he was 6 months old, he was sitting up on his own and watching everything in the room with an attention that Clara Voss said was a sign of intelligence, and that Pete Garland said meant the boy was going to be difficult, which he said as a compliment. The freight operation in 1880 expanded again. The county contract was renewed for another 3 years, this time with better terms because Stella had delivered on every route and every tally without exception for the previous 12 months, and the county commissioner, who had started out professionally courteous and had shifted to genuinely respectful over the course of a year of unimpeachable work, negotiated with her as an equal without any apparent strain. They bought the 3rd wagon's twin in the spring, which meant they now ran 4 wagons and had 4 drivers counting Stella herself, though she was driving less frequently now than she had been. She had moved her own role toward the administrative and planning side, which was partly because Walter was an infant, and partly because the operation had grown to the point where the management of it was a full occupation in itself. Jeremiah was the road manager in the practical sense, which meant he organized the routes and supervised the other drivers and did the horse medicine and the equipment maintenance. He had not been demoted or superseded. They had discussed the shape of the operation at the kitchen table over 2 evenings in January, and arrived at this division because it made practical sense, and Stella made the point explicitly that the business was hers in the sense that she had built it and carried it forward, and that his role was a partnership, not an ownership, and he had said yes, of course, and meant it, And that was the entire discussion. Redemption Creek in 1880 was growing. The railroad had bypassed the town proper, which was a blow to some people's hopes, but the county seat had begun to develop in a direction that meant Redemption Creek was no longer entirely isolated. A new saloon had opened and then closed. The school had added a second teacher. Clara Voss had delivered 17 babies in the past 2 years and had said in a letter to her colleagues in Philadelphia that she intended to stay indefinitely. The Whitfield family had expanded the general store. 2 new families had settled permanently on small holdings to the north, one of which was a Mexican family named Herrera, whose eldest daughter Maria had started at the school that fall, and whose father had come to see Stella about work, because he had heard she was a fair employer. She had hired him as a driver and found him excellent, which was unsurprising given that Pete Garland had made the recommendation. It was, in its particular modest and hard-worked way, a community that was building itself into something that might last. Stella sat at her desk one evening in October of 1880 with the freight ledger open in front of her and Walter asleep in the next room, and Jeremiah at the kitchen table with a set of route maps and a cup of coffee, and she looked at the numbers in the ledger with the clear, certain feeling of someone who has done what they intended to do. The operation was not just solvent. It was profitable, genuinely and increasingly so, in a way that created options rather than just stability. She closed the ledger and sat for a moment looking at the small turquoise ring on her finger which she wore every day because it was the right weight and the right fit. Jeremiah looked up from his maps. "Done for the night," he said. "For tonight," she said. He folded the map and pushed back from the table. "I was thinking about the Langtry question again," he said. "The cutoff is faster in good weather," she said. "We have established this." "What I was thinking," he said, coming around the table and standing behind her, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders in the easy, familiar way they had developed over 2 years of marriage, "is whether we should plan the November runs to go all via Comstock regardless, so the drivers don't have to judge the cutoff weather themselves." She considered this. "Yes," she said. "That's right, put it in the route guidance." "Done," he said, and pressed a brief kiss to the top of her head. "Come to bed." "One more thing," she said, not moving. "One more thing," he agreed, and did not rush her because he never did. She looked at the ledger and then at the route maps he had left on the table and then at the dark window that showed the October night and the distant spark of a lantern from somewhere in the town. "I think we should build the proper house," she said. He was quiet behind her for a moment. "Where?" "Out past the north end of town," she said. "There's a piece of land with the creek running through it. There's enough water there for a kitchen garden and the horses. We could build something solid." "We have a solid house," he said. "We have my father's house, which is good," she said. "But I would like to build one from the beginning together for what we are now rather than what was here before." He came around her chair and crouched down in front of her, his forearms on his knees, looking at her in the lamplight with the same quality of attention he had first given her in the dust outside the livery. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since spring," she said. "All right," he said simply. She smiled at him, not the small careful smile she had been using since childhood for things that were public, but the full one that she had found out belonged specifically to him. "All right," she said. "You've thought it through," he said. "The creek, the garden, the horses, the room for the business. I expect you have a layout in mind." "I have a rough one," she said. "Show me instead of just telling me," he said, and the slight emphasis on those 3 words was deliberate and she heard it perfectly. She laughed, which was a thing she did more frequently now than she had before. "Get the paper," she said, and he got it. They sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight that October night, drawing the house out on rough paper by lamplight, arguing productively about windows and the placement of the storeroom, and whether the barn should be attached or separate. They concluded, because attached barns in Texas were fire risks she did not intend to live with. They filled half a dozen sheets of paper with crossed-out plans and revised ones, and by the time they were finished they had something that was a genuine plan. The land north of town was purchased in November, and Jeremiah arranged the survey. He did not arrange it in her name or in his name, but in both names together, which she noted when she signed the document, and which required no comment beyond the fact of it. They broke ground in the spring of 1881, hiring 2 men from town for the major framing, and doing a great deal of the work themselves on weekends and in the long evening light. Walter, who was 16 months old by then, and walking with the determined aggression of a small person who had places to be, spent the building site visits in the supervision of Samuel Ortiz's wife, Maria Elena, who was 17, and had taken a strong interest in Walter's well-being that appeared to be mutual. The house went up through the summer and was roofed by August, which was a faster pace than Stella had expected. Jeremiah had spent time on the building with the same quality of focus he gave to everything present, careful, interested in doing it correctly rather than quickly, though the two had largely coincided. The walls were thick adobe over a frame, which was the right choice for the Texas climate. The windows were more numerous than was strictly necessary, which Stella had insisted on because she had grown up in a house that was darker than it needed to be, and she had no intention of repeating that. They moved in on a Sunday in October of 1881, when the air had gone sharp and clear, and the sky was the deep autumn blue that could make even a person not inclined toward sentiment stop and look at it. The house was not finished in every detail. There were shelves not yet built, and floors not yet sealed, and a kitchen garden that was still entirely theoretical, but it was habitable and solid and entirely their own. Stella stood in the main room in the early afternoon and looked at the light coming through the south windows and listened to the sound of the small creek that ran along the north edge of the property, and she had the distinct sensation of something completing itself, not in the sense of being over, but in the sense of having arrived at a shape that was right. Jeremiah came through the door behind her with Walter on his hip, the boy eating something questionable that he had found in the yard and was being allowed to examine before it was confiscated. He stopped when he saw her expression. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. He came to stand beside her, and she leaned against him, and they looked at the light together, and Walter said something emphatic about whatever was in his hand, and the creek made its quiet sound through the October air. Life in Redemption Creek continued to build itself around them. The freight operation in 1882 was the most profitable year it had ever seen. The county contract had grown to include 4 additional settlements, and Stella had added 2 more drivers, which meant the operation now employed 6 people outside herself and Jeremiah, including Pete Garland, who had officially retired from driving, but continued to come in 3 mornings a week to help with equipment maintenance because, as he said, he had spent 40 years in the freight business and was not going to spend his remaining ones entirely useless. Clara Voss, who had become Stella's closest friend in the particular way that practical, competent women become essential to each other in places where they are rare, came to supper once a week, and was Walter's unofficial godmother in the secular sense, meaning she was the person he went to when he had a cut or a bruise, and he had an early understanding that her black bag meant help rather than fear. In the winter of 1882, Stella discovered she was expecting again. She told Jeremiah on a Sunday morning in February, sitting at the same kitchen table where she had told him about Walter, with the same quality of directness. He was holding his coffee cup, and he set it down carefully and looked at her with the same expression he had worn in the barn that April evening in 1879, the door going open from inside. "March," he said. "September," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hands were rough from the equipment work and warm from the coffee cup and entirely familiar. "How are you feeling?" "Currently fine," she said. "Ask me again in a month." He smiled. "Walter is going to be insufferable about this," he said. "Walter is 3 years old," she said. "He has opinions," Jeremiah said. "Strong opinions about everything, have you noticed? He has your persistence," she said. "He has your certainty," Jeremiah said. She looked at him. "He has both," she said. Their daughter was born in September of 1882, on an evening when the heat had finally begun to let go of its summer hold, and a breeze was moving through the south windows of the house they had built. Clara Voss delivered her with the same competent efficiency as Walter, and Jeremiah sat where Clara told him to sit and held Stella's hand and was as steady as he always was. The girl came into the world with less volume than Walter had and more intensity, looking up with large eyes that were going to be brown, Clara predicted, and a focused expression that suggested she was already deciding things. "What is her name?" Clara said, writing in the record book she kept. Stella looked at Jeremiah. They had not discussed a name for a girl in the same detailed way they had discussed Walter's. The boy's name had been decided without discussion. The girls felt like it should be made together. "Beatrice," Jeremiah said quietly. "My grandmother's name." Stella looked at the baby in her arms, at the focused expression and the brown eyes already deciding things. "Beatrice," she said, and it was right. "Beatrice Ruth Keene," Jeremiah said, the Ruth being Stella's mother's name, which he had offered before she asked, because he had been thinking about it too. Clara wrote it down. The evening air moved through the south windows and the creek made its small sound, and Walter, who had been at Pete Garland's house for the occasion, would be brought home in the morning to meet his sister. He met her with the expression of someone confronted with a fait accompli of uncertain merit, studied her for a long time in his mother's arms, and then appeared to arrive at a conclusion. "She is very small," he said. "You were small once," Jeremiah told him. Walter considered this assertion doubtfully. "She can stay," he said finally, in the tone of someone exercising magnanimity, and went outside to play. The years in Redemption Creek arranged themselves around the work, and the family and the particular texture of a life built deliberately in a hard place. The freight operation continued to grow, and then, in 1884, to reach a size that Stella decided was the right size, large enough to be genuinely prosperous, small enough to manage well. She turned down a contract that would have required expanding beyond that size, which surprised some people and did not surprise Jeremiah at all. He did not stop being interested in her, which she had observed was not universal among married men as the years progressed. He still watched her across a room. He still listened to her in the specific way he had always listened, as though what she said was worth the attention it deserved. He still sat across from her at the kitchen table in the evenings and asked what she thought about the things they were dealing with, and she knew by the way he used her answers that he was not asking for form. Walter grew into a serious, capable boy who had his father's patience and his mother's directness, and an intense interest in horses that manifested itself practically at age 5, when he began following Samuel Ortiz around the livery, with a level of focused attention that reminded everyone of his mother at work. By the time he was 8, he could harness a team under supervision, and Jeremiah had started teaching him the horse medicine in the evenings by lantern light in the barn, the same way Jeremiah's own father had taught him the harness work in Missouri. Beatrice grew into a child who was quieter than Walter in the sense of speaking less, and was louder than Walter in the sense of having stronger opinions about more things. She was Clara Voss's particular favorite, which Clara denied when accused and demonstrated constantly through actions. She had decided by age 4 that she was interested in reading everything she could find, which in Redemption Creek in 1886 was a limited library but an interesting one, and she had convinced the school teacher, a patient young man named Mr. Avery who had come from Austin, that she was ready for lessons 2 years before the usual age. Stella watched her daughter with the particular feeling of seeing something you recognize in a new form. "She is very like you," Jeremiah said one evening, watching Beatrice at the kitchen table with a book, her small face arranged in the expression of concentrated attention. "She is going to do whatever she decides to do," Stella said. "Yes," Jeremiah said simply. "That is exactly what I mean." In the fall of 1885, Pete Garland died quietly in his sleep, which Clara Voss said was the best possible way, and which the whole of Redemption Creek mourned in the way of losing someone who had been a constant for long enough that his constancy had become part of the place. He was buried in the churchyard, and the Reverend Hodges spoke about him with the warmth of long knowledge. And Stella stood at the graveside with Jeremiah's arm around her, and Walter holding her hand on the other side and Beatrice asleep in Clara's arms, and felt the particular grief of losing someone who had known your father, and therefore carried a piece of something irreplaceable. She had told Pete, in the last winter when his health had begun to fail visibly, that the freight operation was what it was partly because of him. He had shaken his head and said it was what it was because she was who she was, and because she had found the right man, which was a thing that could not be planned but could be recognized when it happened. She thought about that at his graveside, and then looked at Jeremiah beside her, who was watching the Reverend with the particular quietness of someone who is thinking about time and the people it takes, and she took his other hand. He looked at her and squeezed her hand once, tight and sure. In 1886, Redemption Creek had grown enough that it was beginning to look like a town, rather than a collection of buildings with ambitions. The railroad spur that had been discussed for 5 years was finally under construction 12 miles to the east, and while it would not come through the town itself, it would pass close enough that the county road connecting Redemption Creek to the spur junction had been improved and graded, which made a material difference to the freight operation. There was talk of a new school building, properly stone rather than wood. Clara Voss's practice had grown to require an assistant, a young man recently graduated from a medical school in St. Louis, who had come west with intentions she supported, and with whom she ran a partnership that served the entire basin. On a Sunday afternoon in October of 1886, Stella sat on the back porch of the house they had built together and watched the creek run between its limestone banks, and thought about the fact that she was 34 years old, and that the sum of her life at present felt like a thing she had wanted before she had known to want it. The kitchen garden was real now, planted by her hands and Jeremiah's over 6 years into something that produced abundantly from March to November. The south windows lit the main room every morning. The shelves Jeremiah had built held books and records, and the particular objects that accumulate in a house where people have been paying attention. A turquoise ring Beatrice wore sometimes on her thumb when she was reading, a broken piece of harness buckle that Walter kept on his windowsill as a memento of his first successful repair, the battered wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to Walter Talbot and hung on the hook by the door where it had hung all of Stella's life. The freight ledgers that lived on the office shelf, because the workroom had become a proper office, went back 9 years. Every run, every tally, every delivery confirmed and discrepancy corrected, in the handwriting that had shifted from her father's lessons into her own hand, and had continued in the same careful practice for every year since. Jeremiah came out the back door with 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside her on the porch step, close enough that their shoulders were touching, which was still the same as it had always been. "Walter has been at the barn for 3 hours," he said. "He's working on the near horse's hoof," she said. "He noticed it was soft yesterday." Jeremiah looked at her. "You noticed," he said. "He noticed," she said. "I might have confirmed that his observation was correct." He handed her the coffee. It was the good stuff bought from the general store's recent expansion of stock, another thing that had changed. "The ledgers look good for this year," he said. "The ledgers look very good," she said. "October through December should finish it well if the weather holds for the north route." "The weather will hold," he said. "You do not know that," she said. "I have a feeling," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Your feelings are not a reliable meteorological instrument." "My feelings," he said, "are very reliable about most things." She held his gaze for a moment, his dark eyes warm in the afternoon light, and the corner of his mouth pulling in the way it had pulled since the morning he crouched in the dust across from her with a rivet punch and showed her what he knew. "Some things," she allowed. He laughed, low and warm, and put his arm around her, and she settled against him with the ease of long familiarity that had not become inattention. The creek ran over its limestone in the October afternoon. Somewhere in the barn, Walter was talking to the horses with his father's particular quality of voice. Beatrice was inside with her books, conducting her ongoing project of reading everything available and moving on to what was not. The sun was going west over the low hills in the gold and amber of a Texas October, and the air had the clean, cold edge that meant the seasons were actually turning this time. Redemption Creek was a small town in the basin of southwest Texas, and it would never be a great city and did not intend to be one. The people in it were the kind of people who had come for a reason and stayed because the place had become real to them, which is a different and more durable thing than any plan. It held the graves of the people it had lost, and the houses of the people who had built them, and the school where the next generation was learning what would be needed for the years ahead. Stella Talbot Keene had run a freight operation in this town for 12 years and had built it into something solid. She had 2 children and a house with south-facing windows and a kitchen garden, and a man who had knelt in the dust outside the livery on a July morning in 1878 and shown her what he knew and let her do the work herself, and who had been showing her things and stepping back and letting her do the work herself ever since. Not because he was absent, because he understood the difference between helping and being present, which was not a common understanding and was, in her opinion, one of the more essential things about a person. She had been right that Monday morning to say show me instead of yes or no. She had been right in most of the things she had decided in the intervening years, and wrong in a few, and in the wrong ones she had been corrected and had corrected herself and moved forward, which was what the work required. She drank her coffee in the October afternoon and leaned against her husband, and listened to her son talk to the horses and thought about the next freight run and the year-end ledger, and the conversation she needed to have with the county commissioner about the contract renewal, and all of these things were present and real and entirely manageable. Beatrice appeared at the back door, 4 years old, with a book under her arm and the focused expression she wore when she had decided something. "Mama," she said, "the word in my book says tenacious. What does tenacious mean?" Stella looked at her daughter. She looked at Jeremiah, who was looking at Beatrice with the expression of someone who already knows the answer and wants to hear how the question gets answered. "It means," Stella said carefully, "that when you decide something is worth doing, you do not stop until it is done, and that you do not let other people decide for you that it is not worth doing." Beatrice thought about this for a moment with her whole face. Then she nodded once, with the certainty of a small person who has confirmed a working hypothesis, and went back inside with her book. Jeremiah said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That is exactly what it means." "I know," Stella said. He pressed a kiss to her temple, in the way he did when he was full of something that did not require words, and she let him. And they sat on the back step of the house they had built together in the October afternoon, with the creek running and the horses settled, and the children present and the ledgers adding up correctly, and all of the large important things and all of the small particular ones arranged themselves around them like a life that had been built rather than found, which was, as her father had always said, the better kind. The sun moved west, the creek ran on. The smoke from the chimney went straight up in the still air, which Jeremiah had told her once meant settled weather, and she had told him that was not scientifically established, and he had said nevertheless, and here it was doing exactly what he had said it would do, which she had noted and would not be mentioning out loud. She smiled at the creek. Beside her, Jeremiah Keene said, "What?" "Nothing," she said. "That is absolutely something," he said. She looked at him and let him see the smile fully and said, "The smoke is going straight up." He looked at the smoke and then at her and smiled the full smile that had been hers since a July morning in 1878 and said, "I told you." "You told me," she agreed. And the afternoon held them, and the town went on with its building, and the children grew, and the work continued, and the life they had made together was exactly sufficient and more than enough, which is the definition of a good life in any year and any place, but was particularly true in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the fall of 1886. Beside a creek that ran through limestone and a kitchen garden, and a house with south-facing windows where the light came in every morning, and the ledgers added up, and there was always, in the corner of the man's mouth, the beginning of a smile that had not changed in 8 years and showed no sign of changing now.